Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 16 of Queen of Sorcery, and as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book by David Eddings, in this particular case. Moving right along. Chapter 16. The Imperial Palace sat on a high hill in the center of Talhaneth. It consisted not of one building, but rather was a complex of many, large and small, all built of marble and surrounded by gardens and lawns where cypress trees cast a pleasing shade. The entire compound was enclosed by a high wall, surmounted by statues spaced at intervals along its top. The legionnaires at the palace gate recognized the Cherrick ambassador and sent immediately for one of the Emperor's chamberlains, a gray-haired official in a brown mantle. "I need to see Ranbaroon, Lord Morin," Grinnig told him as they all dismounted in a marble courtyard just inside the palace gate. "It's a matter of urgency." "Of course, Lord Grinnig," the gray-haired man assented. "His Imperial Highness is always delighted to speak with the personal envoy of King Endheg. Unfortunately, His Highness is resting just now. I should be able to get you in to see him sometime this afternoon. Tomorrow morning at the latest." "This won't wait, Morin," Grinnig said. "We have to see the Emperor immediately. You better go wake him up." Lord Morin looked surprised. "It can't be that urgent," he suggested chidingly. "I'm afraid so," Grinnig said. Morin pursed his lips thoughtfully as he looked at each member of the party. "You know me well enough to realize that I wouldn't ask this lightly, Morin," Grinnig said. Morin sighed. "I'm trusting you a great deal, Grinnig. All right, come along. Ask your soldiers to wait." Grinnig made a curt gesture to his guards, and the party followed Lord Morin through a broad courtyard to a columned gallery that ran along one of the buildings. "How's he been?" Grinnig asked as they walked along the shady gallery. "His health is still good," Morin answered, "but his temper's been deteriorating lately. The Baroons have been resigning their posts in flocks and returning to Tal Baroon." "That seems prudent under the circumstances," Grinnig said. "I suspect that a certain number of fatalities are likely to accompany the succession." "Probably so," Morin agreed, "but His Highness finds it a bit distressing to be abandoned by members of his own family." He stopped by an arched marble gate where two legionnaires in gold-embellished breastplates stood stiffly. "Please leave your weapons here. His Highness is sensitive about such things. I'm sure you can understand." "Of course," Grinnig said, pulling a heavy sword out from under his mantle and leaning it against the wall. They all followed his example, and Lord Morin's eyes flickered slightly with surprise when Silk removed 3 daggers from various places beneath his garments. "Formidable equipment," the Chamberlain's hands flickered in the gestures of the secret language. "Troubled times," Silk's fingers explained appreciatingly. Lord Morin smiled faintly and led them through the gate into the garden beyond. The lawn in the garden was neatly manicured. There were softly splashing fountains, and the rose bushes were all well pruned. Fruit trees that seemed to be very old were budding, almost ready to burst into bloom in the warm sun. Sparrows bickered over nesting sites on the twisted limbs. Grinnig and the others followed Morin along a curving marble walk toward the center of the garden. Ranbaroon the 13th, Emperor of Tal Nidra, was a small, elderly man, quite bald and dressed in a gold-colored mantle. He lounged in a heavy chair beneath a budding grape arbor, feeding small seeds to a bright canary perched on the arm of his chair. The Emperor had a little beak-like nose and bright, inquisitive eyes. "I said I wanted to be left alone, Morin," he said in a testy voice, looking up from the canary. "A million apologies, Your Highness," Lord Morin explained, bowing deeply. "Lord Grinnig, the ambassador of Cherrick, wishes to present you a matter of gravest urgency. He convinced me that it simply could not wait." The Emperor looked sharply at Grinnig. His eyes grew sly, almost malicious. "I see that your beard's beginning to grow back, Grinnig." Grinnig's face flushed slowly. "I should have known that your Highness would have heard of my little misfortune." "I know everything that happens in Talhaneth, Lord Grinnig," the Emperor snapped. "Even if all my cousins and nephews are running like rats out of a burning house, I still have a few faithful people around me. Whatever possessed you to take up with that Nadrak woman? I thought you Alords despised Angarax." Grinnig coughed awkwardly and glanced quickly at Aunt Paul. "It was kind of a joke, Your Highness," he said. I thought it might embarrass the Nadrak ambassador, and his wife is, after all, a handsome-looking woman. I didn't know she kept a pair of scissors under her bed. She keeps your beard in a little box, you know, the Emperor smirked, and she shows it to all her friends. She's an evil woman, grinning, said mournfully. Who are these? The Emperor asked, waving one finger at the members of the party standing on the grass somewhat behind Ambassador Grinnig. My cousin Beric and some friends, Grinnig said. They're the ones who have come to talk to you. The Earl of Trelheim? The Emperor asked. What are you doing in Talhanith, my lord? Passing through, your highness, Beric replied, bowing. Ranbruin looked sharply at each of the rest in turn, as if actually seeing them for the first time. And this would be Prince Keldar of Drasnia, he said, who left Talhanith in a hurry last time he was here, posing as an acrobat in a traveling circus, I believe, and about one jump ahead of the police. Silk also bowed politely. And Heder of Algaria, the Emperor continued, the man who's trying to depopulate Thalmurgo single-handedly. Heder inclined his head. Morin, the Emperor demanded sharply, why have you surrounded me with Alords? I don't like Alords. It's this matter of urgency, your highness, Morin replied apologetically. And an errand? The Emperor said, looking at Mandaralin. A Mimbrate, I should say. His eyes narrowed. From the descriptions I've heard, he could only be the Baron of Vomandor. Mandaralin's bow was gracefully elaborate. Thine eye is most keen, your highness, to have read us each in turn without prompting. Not all of you precisely, the Emperor said. I don't recognize the Sendar or the Riven lad. Garion's mind jumped. Beric had once told him that he resembled a Riven more than anything else, but that thought had been lost in the welter of events which had followed the chance remark. Now that the Emperor of Talnidra, whose eyes seemed to have an uncanny ability to penetrate to the true nature of things, had also identified him as a Reven, he glanced quickly at Aunt Paul, but she seemed absorbed in examining the buds on a rose bush. The Sendar is Dernig, Mr. Wolf said. A smith in Sendaria, that useful trade is considered somewhat akin to nobility. The lad is my grandson, Garion. The Emperor looked at the old man. It seems that I should know you. There's something about you. He paused thoughtfully. The canary, which had been perched on the arm of the Emperor's chair, suddenly burst into song. He launched himself into the air and fluttered directly to Aunt Paul. She held out her finger, and the bright bird landed there, tipped back his head, and sang ecstatically as if his tiny heart were breaking with adoration. She listened gravely to his song. She wore a dark blue dress, elaborately laced at the bodice, and a short sable cape. "What are you doing with my canary?" the Emperor demanded. "Listening," she said. "How did you get him to sing? I've been trying to coax him into song for months." "You didn't take him seriously enough." "Who is this woman?" the Emperor asked. "My daughter, Polgara," Mr. Wolf said. "She has a particularly keen understanding of birds." The Emperor laughed suddenly, a harsh, skeptical laugh. "Oh, come now, you really don't expect me to accept that, do you?" Wolf looked at him gravely. "Are you really sure you don't know me, Ranbaroon?" he asked mildly. The pale green mantle Grinnig had lent him made him look almost like a Talnidran. Almost, but not quite. "It's a clever ruse," the Emperor said. "You look the part, and so does she, but I'm not a child. I gave up fairy tales a long time ago." "That's a pity. I'd guess your life's been a little empty since then." Wolf looked around at the manicured garden with the servants and fountains and the members of the Emperor's personal guard posted unobtrusively here and there among the flower beds. "Even with all this, Ranbaroon, a life without any wonder left in it is flat and stale." His voice was a little sad. "I think that perhaps you gave up too much." "Morin," Ranbaroon demanded peremptorily, "send for Zeril. We'll settle this immediately." "At once, your highness," Morin said, and beckoned to one of the servants. May I have my canary back? The Emperor asked Aunt Paul rather plaintively. Of course. She moved across the grass toward the chair, stepping slowly to avoid startling the trilling little bird. Sometimes I wonder what they're saying when they sing, Ranbaroon said. Right now, he's telling me about the day he learned to fly, Aunt Paul said. That's a very important day for a bird. She reached out her hand, and the canary hopped onto the Emperor's finger, still singing, and with its bright eyes cocked toward Ranbaroon's face. That's an amusing conceit, I suppose, the little old man smiled, staring out at the sunlight sparkling on the water in one of the fountains. But I'm afraid I don't have time for that kind of thing. Right now, the whole nation is holding its breath in anticipation of my death. They all seem to think that the greatest thing I can do for Talnidra is to die immediately. Some of them have gone to the trouble of trying to help me along. We caught 4 assassins in the palace grounds just last week. The Baroons, my own family, are deserting me to the point that I scarcely have enough people left to run the palace, much less the Empire. Ah, here comes Zero. A lean, bushy-browed man in a red mantle, covered with mystic symbols, scurried across the lawn and bowed deeply to the Emperor. You sent for me, your highness? I'm informed that this woman is Pulgara the sorceress, the Emperor said, and that the old man there is Belgarath. Be a good fellow, Zero, and have a look into their credentials. Belgarath and Pulgara? The bushy-browed man scoffed. Surely your highness isn't serious. The names are mythological. No such people exist. You see, the Emperor said to Aunt Paul, you don't exist. I have it on the very best authority. Zero's a wizard himself, you know. Really? One of the very best, he assured her. Of course, most of his tricks are just sleight of hand, since sorcery is only a sham. But he amuses me, and he takes himself very seriously. You may proceed, Zero, but try not to raise an awful stink. You usually do. That won't be necessary, your highness, Zero said flatly. If they were wizards of any kind, I'd have recognized them immediately. We have special ways of communicating, you know. Aunt Paul looked at the wizard with one eyebrow slightly raised. I think that you should look a bit closer, Zero, she suggested. Sometimes we miss things. She made an almost imperceptible gesture, and Garion seemed to hear a faint rush of sound. The wizard stared, his eyes fixed on open air directly in front of him. His eyes began to bulge, and his face turned deathly pale. As if his legs had been cut from under him, he fell onto his face. Forgive me, Lady Pulgara, he croaked, groveling. That's supposed to impress me, I assume, the Emperor said. I've seen men's minds overwhelmed before, however, and Zero's mind isn't all that strong to begin with. This is getting tiresome, Ranbaroon, she said tartly. You really ought to believe her, you know. The canary spoke in a tiny, piping voice. I knew who she was immediately. Of course, we're much more perceptive than you think that creep around on the ground. Why do you do that? If you just try, I'm sure you'd be able to fly. And I wish you'd stop eating so much garlic. It makes you smell awful. Hush now, Aunt Paul said gently to the bird. You can tell him all about it later. The Emperor was trembling violently, and he stared at the bird as if it were a snake. Why don't we all just behave as if we believe that Pulgara and I are who we say we are, Mr. Wolf suggested. We could spend the rest of the day trying to convince you, and we really don't have that much time. There are some things I have to tell you, and they're important, no matter who I am. I think I can accept that, Ranbaroon said, still trembling and staring at the now silent canary. Mr. Wolf clasped his hands behind his back and stared up at a cluster of bickering sparrows on the limb of a nearby tree. Early last fall, he began, Zadar, the apostate, crept into the throne room of Riva and stole the orb of Alder. He did what? Ranbaroon demanded, sitting up quickly. How? We don't know, Wolf answered. When I catch up with him, maybe I'll ask him. I'm sure, however, that you can see the importance of the event. Obviously, the Emperor said. The Alorns and the Sendars are quietly preparing for war, Wolf told him. War? Ranbaroon asked in a shocked voice. With whom? The Angarax, of course. What's Zadar got to do with the Angarax? He could be acting on his own, couldn't he? Surely you're not that simple, Aunt Paul remarked. You forget yourself, lady, Ranbaroon said stiffly. Where's Zadar now? He went through Talhaneth about 2 weeks ago, Wolf replied. If he can get across the border into one of the Angarak kingdoms before I can stop him, the Alorns will march. And Arendia with them, Mandaralan said firmly. King Coradolan has been advised. You'll tear the world apart, the Emperor protested. Perhaps, Wolf admitted. But we can't let Zadar get to Torak with the orb. I'll send emissaries at once, Ranbaroon said. This has to be headed off before it gets out of hand. It's a little late for that, Barrack said grimly. Enheg and the others aren't in the mood for Talnidran diplomacy right now. Your people have a bad reputation in the north, Your Highness, Silk pointed out. They always seem to have a few trade agreements up their sleeves. Every time Talnidra mediates a dispute, it seems to cost a great deal. I don't think we can afford your good offices anymore. A cloud passed in front of the sun, and the garden seemed suddenly chilly in its shadow. This is being blown all out of proportion, the Emperor protested. The Alorns and the Angarax haven't been squabbling over that worthless stone for thousands of years. You've been waiting for the chance to fall on each other, and now you've got an excuse. Well, enjoy yourselves. Talnidra's not going to get involved as long as I'm her emperor. You're not going to be able to sit this to one side in this, Ranbaroon, Aunt Paul said. Why not? The orb doesn't concern me one way or the other. Go ahead and destroy each other if you want. Talnidra will still be here when it's all over. I doubt it, Wolf told him. Your empire's crawling with Murgos. They could overrun you in a week. They're honest merchants, here on honest business. Murgos don't have honest business, Aunt Paul told him. Every Murgo in Talnidra is here because he was sent by the Grallum High Priest. That's an exaggeration, Ranbaroon said stubbornly. The whole world knows that you and your father have an obsessive hatred of all Angarax, but times have changed. Thal Murgos is still ruled from Rakthal, Wolf said, and Tuchik is master there. Tuchik hasn't changed, even if the world has. The merchants from Rakgaska might seem civilized to you, but they all jump when Tuchik whistles, and Tuchik's the disciple of Torak. Torak's dead! Really? Aunt Paul said. Have you seen his grave? Have you opened the grave and seen his bones? My empire's very expensive to run, the Emperor said, and I need the revenue the Murgos bring me. I've got agents in Rakgaska and all along the South Caravan route, so I know if the Murgos were getting ready for any kind of move against me. I'm just a little suspicious that all this might be the result of some internal contention within the Brotherhood of Sorcerers. You people have your own motives, and I'm not going to let you use my empire as a pawn in your power struggles. And if the Angarax win, Aunt Paul said, how do you plan to deal with Torak? I'm not afraid of Torak. Have you ever met him? Wolf asked. Obviously not. Listen, Belgarath, you and your daughter have never been friendly to Talnidra. You treated us like a defeated enemy after Vomimber. Your information's interesting, and I'll consider it in its proper perspective. But Talnidra policy is not dominated by Alorn preconceptions. Our economy relies heavily on trade along the South Caravan route. I'm not going to disrupt my empire simply because you happen to dislike Murgos. You're a fool, then, Wolf said bluntly. You'd be surprised at how many people think so, the Emperor replied. Maybe you'll have better luck with my successor. If he's a Vorduvian or a Honeth, you might even be able to bribe him. But Baroons don't take bribes. Or advice, Aunt Paul added. Only when it suits us, Lady Pulgera, Ranbaroon said. I think we've done everything we can here, Wolf decided. A bronze door at the back of the garden slammed open, and a tiny girl with flaming hair stormed through, her eyes ablaze. At first, Garion thought she was a child, but as she came closer, he realized she was somewhat older than that. Although she was very small, the short, sleeveless green tunic she wore displayed limbs that were much closer to maturity. He felt a peculiar kind of shock when he saw her, almost, but not quite, like recognition. Her hair was a tumbled mass with long, elaborate curls cascading down over her neck and shoulders, and it was a color that Garion had never seen before, a deep burnished red that seemed somehow to glow from within. Her skin was a golden color that seemed, as she swept through the shadows of the trees near the gate, to have an almost greenish cast to it. She was in a state verging on sheer rage. "Why am I being kept prisoner here?" she demanded of the Emperor. "What are you talking about?" Ranbaroon asked. "The Legionnaires won't let me leave the palace grounds." "Oh," the Emperor said, "that." "Exactly that." "They're acting on my orders, Sinedra," the Emperor told her. "So they said. Tell them to stop it." "No." "No?" Her tone was incredulous. "No?" Her voice climbed several octaves. "What do you mean, no?" "It's too dangerous for you to be out in the city just now," the Emperor said plaintively. "Nonsense," she snapped. "I don't intend to sit around in the stuffy palace just because you're afraid of your own shadow. I need some things from the market." "Send someone." "I don't want to send anyone," she shouted at him. "I want to go myself." "Well, you can't," he said flatly. "Spend your time on your studies instead." "I don't want to study," she cried. "Jeevers is a stuffy idiot, and he bores me. I don't want to sit around talking about history or politics or any of the rest of it. I just want an afternoon to myself." "I'm sorry." "Please, Father," she begged, her tone dropping into a wheedling note. She took hold of one of the folds of his gold mantle and twisted it around one of her tiny fingers. "Please." The look she directed at the Emperor through her lashes would have melted stone. "Absolutely not," he said, refusing to look at her. "My order stands. You will not leave the palace grounds." "I hate you!" she cried. Then she ran from the garden in tears. "My daughter," the Emperor explained almost apologetically, "you can't imagine what it's like having a child like that." "Oh, I can imagine, all right," Mr. Wolf said, glancing at Aunt Paul. She looked back at him, her eyes challenging. "Go ahead and say it, Father," she told him. "I'm sure you won't be happy until you do." Wolf shrugged. "Forget it." Ranbaroon looked thoughtfully at the two of them. "It occurs to me that we might be able to negotiate a bit here," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What do you have in mind?" Wolf asked. "You have a certain authority among the Alorns," the Emperor suggested. "Some," Wolf admitted carefully. "If you were to talk to them, I'm sure they'd be willing to overlook one of the more absurd provisions of the Accords of Vomember." "Which one is that?" "There's really no necessity for Sinedra to journey to Riva, is there? I'm the last emperor of the Baroon dynasty, and when I die, she won't be an imperial princess anymore. Under the circumstances, I'd say that the requirement doesn't really apply to her. It's nonsense anyway. The line of the Rivan king became extinct 1,300 years ago, so there isn't going to be any bridegroom waiting for her in the hall of the Rivan king. As you've seen, Talnidra's a very dangerous place just now. Sinedra's 16th birthday is only half a year or so off, and the date's well known. If I have to send her to Riva, half the assassins in the Empire are going to be lurking outside the palace gates, waiting for her to come out. I'd rather not take that kind of risk. If you could see your way clear to speak to the Alorns, I might be able to make a few concessions regarding the Burgos, restrictions on their numbers, closed areas, that sort of thing." "No, Ranbaroon," Aunt Paul said flatly. "Sinedra will go to Riva. You fail to understand that the Accords are only a formality. If your daughter's the one destined to become the bride of the Rivan king, No force on earth can prevent her from being in the throne room at Riva on the appointed day. My father's recommendations about the Murgos are only suggestions for your own good. What you choose to do about the matter is your affair. I think we've just about exhausted the possibilities of this conversation, the Emperor stated coldly. Two important-looking officials came into the garden and spoke briefly to Lord Morin. Your Highness, the gray-haired Chamberlain said deferentially, the Minister of Trade wanted to inform you that he's reached an excellent agreement with the trade disposition from Rakgoska. The gentlemen from Thalmurgos were most accommodating. I'm delighted to hear it, Ranbrood said, throwing a meaningful look at Mr. Wolf. The contingent from Rakgoska would like to pay their respects before they leave, Morin added. By all means, the Emperor said. I'll be delighted to receive them here. Morin turned and nodded shortly to the two officials near the gate. The officials turned and spoke to someone outside, and the gate swung open. 5 Murgos strode into the garden. Their coarse black robes were hooded, but the hoods were thrown back. The front of their robes were unclasped, and the chainmail shirts they all wore gleamed in the sunlight. The Murgo in front was a bit taller than the others, and his bearing indicated that he was the leader of the deputation. A welter of images and partial memories flooded Garion's mind as he looked at the scar-faced enemy he had known all his life. The strange pull of the silent, hidden linkage between them touched him. It was Asherak. Something brushed Garion's mind, tentative only, not the powerful force the Murgo had directed at him in the dim hallway in Engheg's palace at Alorn. The amulet under his tunic became very cold, and yet seemed to burn at the same time. Your Imperial Highness, Asherak said, striding forward with a cold smile, we are honored to be admitted into your august presence. He bowed, his mail shirt clinking. Beric was holding Hedder's right arm firmly, and Mandaralin moved and took the other. I'm overjoyed to see you again, worthy Asherak, the Emperor said. I'm told that an agreement has been reached. Beneficial to both sides, your Highness. The best kind of agreement, Ranbrood approved. Tar-Urgas, King of the Murgos, sends greetings, Asherak said. His Majesty most keenly expresses his desirability of cementing relations between Thalmurgos and Talnidra. He hopes that one day he may call your Imperial Highness brother. We respect the peaceful intentions and legendary wisdom of Tar-Urgas, the Emperor smiled with a certain smugness. Asherak looked around, his black eyes flat. Well, Ambar, he said to Silk, your fortunes seem to have improved since we met in Mingan's counting room in Doreen. Silk spread his hands in an innocent-looking gesture. The gods have been kind, most of them anyway. Asherak smiled briefly. You know each other? The Emperor asked, a bit surprised. We've met, your Highness, Silk admitted. In another kingdom, Asherak added. He looked directly then at Mr. Wolf. Belgarath, he said politely with a brief nod. Chamdar, the old man replied. You're looking well. Thank you. It seems that I'm the only stranger here, the Emperor said. Chamdar and I have known each other for a very long time, Mr. Wolf told him. He glanced at the Murgo with a faintly malicious twinkle in his eyes. I see that you've managed to recover from your recent indisposition. Asherak's face flickered with annoyance, and he looked quickly at his shadow on the grass as if for reassurance. Garion remembered what Wolf had said atop the Tor after the attack of the Olgoths, something about a shadow returning by an indirect route. For some reason, the information that Asherak the Murgo and Chamdar the Goralum were the same man did not particularly surprise him. Like a complex melody that had been faintly out of tune, the sudden merging of the two seemed right somehow. The knowledge clicked in his mind like a key in a lock. Someday you'll have to show me how you did that, Asherak was saying. I found the experience interesting. My horse had hysterics, however. My apologies to your horse. Why is it that feel as if I'm missing half of this conversation? Ranbaroon asked. Forgive us, your highness, Asherak said. Ancient Belgarath and I are renewing an old enmity. We've seldom had the opportunity to speak to each other with any degree of civility. He turned and bowed politely to Aunt Paul. My Lady Pulgera, you're as beautiful as ever. He eyed her with a deliberately suggestive stare. You haven't changed much either, Chandar. Her tone was mild, even bland, but Garion, who knew her so well, recognized immediately the deadly insult she had just delivered to the Grolem. Charming, Asherak said with a faint smile. This is better than a play, the Emperor cried delightedly. You people are actually dripping with malice. I wish I'd had the opportunity to see the first act. The first act was very long, your highness, Asherak said, and quite often tedious. As you may have noticed, Belgarath sometimes gets carried away with his own cleverness. I'm certain I'll be able to make up for that, Mr. Wolf told him with a slight smile. I promise you that the last act will be extremely short, Chandar. Threats, old man? Asherak asked. I thought we'd agreed to be civilized. I can't recall when we ever agreed on anything, Wolf said. He turned to the Emperor. I think we'll leave now, Ranbaroon, he said. With your permission, of course. Of course, the Emperor replied. I'm pleased to have met you, though I still don't believe in you, naturally. My skepticism, however, is theological, not personal. I'm glad of that, Wolf said, and quite suddenly he grinned impishly at the Emperor. Ranbaroon laughed. I look forward to our next meeting, Belgarath, Asherak said. I wouldn't if I were you, Wolf advised him, then turned and led the way out of the Emperor's garden.